We on the ICFRC Program Committee sought out Jim some months ago because of how questions about America's foreign relations were looming large in the presidential campaign. Whoever won, we knew, would cause significant change in the country's directions, or could lead to significant changes that we wanted to hear about. And Jim's an ideal person to help us ponder what lies ahead. So please join me in welcoming Jim Leach.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. And let me first say I want to pick up on his last statement because Ed Zastro approached me quite a few months back about giving it a talk after the election. And the reason I mention it, that a number of things I'm going to be saying apply to whomever is going to be elected. And so they're not all attributable to the judgment calls that Mr. Trump will be making, although virtually everything will be changed by the fact of who the President of the United States is, because this has caught the world by surprise, as well as many in America. And so let me just suggest that I have one word theme, and the word is testing. That is, I think the United States administration and government, and therefore implicitly the entire American public, are going to be tested by others outside of America in ways that may be unprecedented, but also ways in which one might be able to forecast somewhat. And so let me just affirm as strongly as I can that some circumstances are brought about by decisions one makes, and then some circumstances are brought about because of decisions other people make. And we, for example, lived in this Cold War era where virtually everything was related to Russia and the United States in some sort of way in American policymaking. Then we're now in a period in which a lot of the things that affect American policy are made by what we might have considered less strategically important countries. And so the Middle East has driven us to our two longest and arguably most debilitating wars psychologically that America has ever been part of. And one of the reasons why Mr. Trump prevailed in this election is that he ran as the anti-establishment candidate because the establishment is what brought us these wars. And it's the establishment that helped facilitate a man-made recession. And so there were senses in America that something was askew. There are also other aspects of this that apply to every country in the world, that we're in a world of virtually frantic change. That is, what hallmarks our times are change and its acceleration. And in a period of change, some people are always benefited, and some people are always, at least relatively speaking, disadvantaged. And so the disadvantaged made their voices heard, as well as for other reasons, Trump put together a majority of the vote. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a likely Trump policy, because we have hints. And with only one exception, they're basically hints without policy meat. The one exception is that somehow, somewhere, a longer or larger wall is likely to be built on our southern border. And whether that's good or bad is a judgment call. But it's clearly the one signal promise in foreign policy, and it happens to be a promise that has enormous implications for a whole continent of people, as well as Central America. And so this is something that's going to be very interesting to watch. But I stress this about making a law longer or taller only in that the way Trump played it, it was that we had no wall and he was going to build a wall. And actually, on a bipartisan basis, some wall has been built. And so the question is, over the last 15 years, how much bigger, how much longer, how much wider, how much taller a new wall will be, with very few Americans expecting that it'll be paid for by Mexico. In any regard, that is a singular Trump foreign policy that is about the only one that to me is a little more than a hint. Now, where are the hints? One is, and of all his hints, some people in this room will disagree with absolutely everything. Some people will agree with most things. Some people will find a little bit of plus and a little bit of minus in some of his issues. It's not 100% black and white, no matter where philosophically or judgmentally one comes from. And the first one fits that category. He instinctively does not appear to want to see America integrally involved in all issues all around the world. And in political science terms, the old hackneyed phrase, but it has some truth to it, is that he doesn't want to see America be policemen for the world. And he hasn't used that phrase, but that's kind of what he means, and he's arrived at it, in my view, from listening to the Russians. And I will explain that in a minute. Anyway, the second strong hint is that he does have a different approach to Russia than the establishment has had, and one that is more sympathetic to the Putin position than others have indicated from a governance perspective. Now, there is one area of potential cooperation that I suspect might develop and might be something that no one here would object to, and that is there is a possibility that we might develop a slightly closer tie to working with Russia on the Syrian problem. And as you may know, Secretary of State John Kerry has been working on this for basically most of the last year and has had some minor successes, and then each success has ended up with the Russians doing something that was not called for, and so it hasn't been a very successful circumstance. Obviously, the Russians want to keep Assad in power. They have a lot of reasons for it. One is kind of a traditional relationship with Syria and Iran. One relates to they have shipping rights off Syria into the Mediterranean, a port access that they like, and Russia, for several centuries always talks about warm water ports, and so this is of some significance to them. But they also have one disadvantage that very few people have noted, and that is Assad is within the Islamic world leans towards support for the Shia over the Sunni, but about 90% of Islamic citizens in Russia are Sunni. And so as he identifies with Shia, that may bring some internal angst within his own society that might or might not be difficult, but it also might mean that he has reasons to want to bring Syria into a more manageable situation than it currently is, and that is something that we have some vested interest as well. Now, how big a vested interest in keeping Assad is a little bit different, but we all want to stabilize Syria. And intriguingly, in the one Syrian episode that is, to me, very interesting, and actually I think I commented about this in a different kind of way 3 years ago when I spoke to this audience, that if you remember, Barack Obama said to the Syrians, we're not going to intervene as long as you don't use chemical weapons. And then chemical weapons were used. And that put the President of the United States on the spot for having drawn a line. And we were preparing to intervene in a very difficult way. And the President was trying to describe kind of a Goldilocks policy of an intervention that wouldn't be too hot or too cold. That is, that we would intervene, but we wouldn't be putting boots on the ground. Anyway, then the Russians stepped in and told Assad, why don't you agree to unilaterally get rid of chemical weapons? And Assad did make that agreement. There are still some chemical weapons that are straying around in Syria and Iraq, but most have been destroyed. And that is the first quasi-cooperative arms control arrangement that was precipitated by a United States threat and brought more or less to conclusion by Russian diplomacy. But the threat was more important than the diplomacy, because the implication when the United States says we're going to go after command and control, and that's what Reagan said in Libya, if you may recall. Command and control can mean the presidency of a country. And we attempted under President Reagan to bomb a place that happened to be the home of Gaddafi in Libya. And it ended up killing a child or an alleged child, because it's not clear, of Gaddafi's. But it didn't get him. But if you were the Syrian president, you might have been a bit worried of your own security. And so there was a lot of incentive for the Syrians to change directions. Whether we can do anything future in Syria, I don't know. I would only stress beyond that in the Middle East, the only certitude is that there will be expected problems and unexpected problems for the next generation or two that could pop up in almost any corner, from the extreme western wing of North Africa to all the way over to Afghanistan. And the U.S. is in an awkward position of having a lot of vested interest and a lot of vested history, but we lack the ability to understand a lot of internal chemistry. And the best statement of it, in my view, was given 60 miles from here at Grinnell College in the year 1963. And I every once in a while think about this, and I think it's worth dwelling on. What was then, or who was then, the greatest historian in the world, a man named Arnold Toynbee, gave a speech at Grinnell College. And in the speech, he had two themes. And one of the themes was that the Russians were absolutely out of sorts in terms of their logic if they thought that Marxist ideology, the idea of class struggle, the idea of economic determinism, in his view, had no historical credence. And then he turned to America, and we were involved probably at one of the preeminent points in the American civil rights struggle. And he said, this is a problem that you have to deal with. But keep in perspective, he said, that there's no indication of a likelihood that we're going to see serious war in the world based on racial distinctions. And so what in essence he said was that economic determinism is unlikely to lead to war in the world. Race is unlikely to lead to war in the world. But for the foreseeable future, the greatest likelihood of conflict is going to be based upon religion. And his speech at that time was totally out of sorts with anything Americans were thinking or Russians were thinking about the Cold War. And it seemed like a very odd thing to assert. But if we think about what's happened in the Middle East in the last decade or two, it's pretty obvious that his judgment is vindicated. And religious struggles are proving to be of seminal significance in how we treat the world and how the world treats us and how it treats each other. And one of the things that I, as a member of Congress, during the part of this era, as I look back on, find very interesting is that we were involved in a struggle in the first Gulf War under H.W. Bush. And it was, from a diplomatic point of view, masterfully handled once it erupted. And we had a war that was actually paid for by others. I mean, fully paid for by others. And it was clearly successful. But then when about a decade later we had 9/11 and Congress started to deal with issues, and then the authorization for war with Iraq came up, I can't recall members on the House floor making any comments about Sunni versus Shia. And what I'm getting at is that was a concept that was unknown. Now everybody in America knows that there's a Sunni-Shia divide. Very few Americans know what it is or why it is, but we know about it. But it is amazing that we'd been involved in a conflict within a decade and had no understanding of the subtleties. And so when you had an administration that became convinced by one or two people, because it was what they wanted to believe, that we would be welcomed with open arms by the Iraqis if we intervened, and that everything would be hunky-dory, and that we would intervene with relative ease, and in intervening with relative ease, we would establish a democratic governance that would bring its people together and become a stable part of the international community. Well, because we didn't understand religion, that didn't come to pass. The second thing I want to raise in terms of Trumpism, when it comes to Russia, clearly Mr. Putin has ideas that are disadvantageous to America, to parties involved, to Europe, to the EU, and to NATO. And I've been part of since leaving Congress, part of a group called the Dartmouth Conference, which is something that dates back to 1960, which is a dozen people on the American side and a dozen people on the Russian side that have been involved in government and have ties to government, meeting off the record to discuss issues between our two countries. This conference has a long history to it. But I will tell you, at the last two Dartmouth Conference meetings, the one consistent line of the Russians, and it's a very interesting one and very meaningful to me, the Russians are saying that Putin has one clear vision, and that is that the Cold War is not over. The second vision is about America and why he's so appalled with America. And that is, rather disdainfully says, it's all right with us in Moscow that America extend power to all sorts of parts of the world. That's fine with us. Make whatever mistakes you want to make, is the way he describes it. But then he says, in our neighborhood, America has to recognize we are a great power. Now let me translate that. Translated, what those two concepts mean is not that a revamping of the lines of Russia is a dream, that in his view it's going to become a reality. And I think that anyone who thinks that the lines that apply to a number of the former provinces of the Soviet Union that are now independent countries are secure is not listening to Putin. And Putin happens to be the significant decision maker at this time, and he also is not, as a quasi-dictator in a democratically elected circumstance, with the elections not being particularly democratic themselves, but elections did occur, is speaking with the majority of the Russian people. He's not out of step in this. And that's particularly the case, obviously, with Crimea, certainly with at least parts of the Ukraine, and in my view, very likely with the Baltic states. And I personally think we are going to be tested. And if you think it through, if there's movement into the Baltics, and by the way, Putin has also been suggesting, if you listen to speeches, and I don't very much, but I read a little bit about it, he's been mentioning the word nuclear over the last 6 or 9 months, not frequently, but not infrequently. And part of the Russian position is that if Russians in any part of the world are being mistreated or disadvantaged, they have the right to intervene to protect them. And I remember several years ago at one of these Dartmouth conferences, I mentioning to one of the interlocutors on their side that I represented once an area that had a little town called Moscow in it. And I suspected that's because there were some people of Russian descent. Did that mean they had the right to intervene in Moscow, Iowa? And that was a little bit of hyperbolic. But what it means is that Putin is less like Stalin than he is Hitler. In this sense, that if you remember the Sudetenland, does that ring a bell with you? And this is an area east of Germany, but had a lot of Germans living in it, and people of German heritage, that is, living in it. And based upon the fact that there were people of German heritage in this area, that fascist Germany had the right to intervene, and that became one of the domino circumstances and leading to World War II in a geopolitical sense. And that is exactly the logic that Putin is now applying to other parts of his former Soviet Union. Now, I don't suspect that every former province is going to be reassembled with new lines of the Russian Republic, but I do suspect that more than a few will be challenged. As far as the old Warsaw Pact, and if you remember, that's Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc. I don't see their lines challenged in a sovereign sense, but I do see Putin trying to exert more geopolitical influence in that region as well. Anyway, this is going to be a big test. And the aspect that is particularly challenging is that all three Baltic states are members of NATO since 2004. And NATO is a mutual defense security treaty. Latvia, for instance, is an independent country with only about 3 million people, a third of which have Russian heritage. And I personally think that may be Putin's next target, but that's just as a speculation that might occur. It might occur as early as this winter or spring. It might never occur, but I personally am apprehensive to the point of thinking it's going to be earlier rather than later. And partly if something happens to Putin, it isn't as if the next head of the Russian state won't be thinking in somewhat similar terms. That this is Putinism, but it isn't anti-Russianism. I mean, there's something about this that is also very, very Russian. And I will tell you that there is no appetite that I know of anywhere in Europe for putting military troops into the Baltics. And so one of the things that has occurred with regard to Crimea and Ukraine is that we've responded with economic sanctions. And our Secretary of State designate nominee has indicated he doesn't think these are particularly effective. That may or may not be the case, but it would imply a change in strategy. And all one can say for sure is that, as an American, that economic sanctions are vastly preferable to military. And if you recall, in the 50s, we had these incidents in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and every American was sympathetic to the uprisings. But we had in the White House a general, Dwight David Eisenhower, and I basically said that you don't take on another party where they have all the logistical advantages. And West Point is an academy that teaches engineering, the main course of which relates to logistics. And all well-trained military people think first and foremost of logistics. And if you think of the Baltic states, one has to say to oneself, that's a pretty hard place to think of going to war with a country that neighbors them. And that doesn't mean it might not happen, because anything could happen. And so that will become a feature of United States governmental decision-making of a very interesting or very profound nature, possibly in the not-too-distant future. Another area that follows on it with some Russian logic to it. And it's very interesting. The only two countries in the world that hinted before the election that they were very sympathetic to Mr. Trump were Russia and China. China not as overtly as Russia, but they took a sign. And the one thing that, well, there are two aspects that they have taken from the Russians that they have come to believe. And one is a theoretical thing. The Chinese are terrifically antagonistic to nonprofit organizations. And they're antagonistic because the Russians have told them that nonprofits played a major role in the Russian Revolution, that is, the revolution to overthrow communism. And that these people movements that are symbolized by nonprofits, the most scary of which, by the way, to Chinese and the Russians thought was very powerful, were environmental nonprofitism, where people would argue that you've got to clean the rivers, you've got to make these plants pollute less, et cetera. And so they're anti-nonprofit, but the philosophical strategic issue that they bought from the Russians are that in their neighborhood, they should be considered dominant. And what is the United States doing, exerting all of these intrusive activities in their neighborhood? And the most important, obviously, is Taiwan. And I want to go into a little bit of the background of the this episode that occurred that got some news, and that relates to what seems to be a fairly simplistic thing, that the president of Taiwan gave a congratulatory call to the President of the United States. And it came to symbolize a little bit, do we treat Taiwan as an independent country? Do we treat it as something separate? And most Americans instinctively would like to treat it as an independent country, but our government has made it very clear for 8 administrations that's not precisely the case. And so let me just go into a little bit of this background. When Richard Nixon decided to recognize China, which most people in international relations area thought was quite wise, in fact, that it was surprisingly late, he did it with the affirmation that Taiwan was part of China. Now, with that affirmation, oddly enough, it was the same philosophical position as the government of Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan. That is, the government on Taiwan argued that it was the government of all of China, just temporarily placed in Taiwan. And so it was not inconsistent with the philosophical position of the government on Taiwan, but it was, in practical terms, radically disappointing to the government on Taiwan. And the way I sometimes describe this is that in international relations, there are two concepts that are virtually synonymous. That is the notion of independence and the notion of self-determination. But the one place they're juxtaposed is on Taiwan. If Taiwan declares independence, it will have no self-determination because China will immediately attack, without any ifs, ands, or buts about it. On the other hand, it can have maximum self-determination if it doesn't declare independence. And the interesting phenomenon in Taiwan is that there are two political parties, and one political party favors independence and one does not. Ironically, the one that does not is the old line Kuomintang, which was the army of Chiang Kai-shek, which was the enemy of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but ironically organized similarly to the Communist Party of of China, in that it had organizational roots much like it, but a philosophy of free enterprise, which made it an oddity. And so when in 1947, when it left the mainland as kind of an escape to Taiwan, it organized itself to control the legislature, and it's called the Legislative Yuan. And by legislature, it had the most wondrous pro-incumbent policy of any legislature in the world, and that is, if Bill here had been elected to the legislature from Shanghai, and he escapes with the Kuomintang to Taiwan, he stays in the legislature until there are free elections in Shanghai to throw him out. In other words, he has life tenure. So it's a democratic legislature without elections, except for those from the Taiwan seats. And it became more democratically, a little bit more Taiwan representation as the bills of the world passed on. By the way, one or two bills actually lived in the United States and were members of the Taiwan legislature, which is kind of nice. At least salary-wise, et cetera. The Far East, they take care of their own. Anyway, this is an issue that could be brought up at any time by people outside the United States and by the Chinese for almost any reason. Now, over much of this time period, the Seventh Fleet is the most awesome fleet in the world over all of this period. But relatively speaking, as much as it improves in capacity, the Chinese, relatively speaking, have gotten capacities that jeopardize the Seventh Fleet. And for example, there are about 1,000 missiles pointed into that area of the world. We have exceptional anti-missile defenses on our big ships, but are they going to be able to handle 1,000? That's a judgment call people might want to make. And so the Chinese, at some point, presumably are going to be pressing to some degree onto Taiwan. If the Russians go into the Baltic states, is that kind of a tripping thing? How America responds would be of some interest, because is it better to respond actively or inactively? And if one responds actively and ineffectively, that could be the worst strategy of all. And so you don't know. These are many, many big types of things. The third point I want to make about Trumpism is that he is anti-multilateral by instinct. And he's related this to trade. He doesn't like multilateral agreements. And this is a really, really serious phenomenon. I mean, you can take any agreement ever made at any time and wish that it could be slightly more biased in an American way. But all agreements are based upon you have to give on some things, take on other things. You cannot, other people have perspectives as well and national interests to follow. And to be anti-multilateral is also the same thing as saying that one is against the expansion of the rule of law into the international arena. And it can have implications for the United Nations. It can have implications of many kinds in many different ways. It affects legislative bodies. For instance, one of, in my views, most indefensible acts of the United States Senate has been, over the last couple generations, that it cannot get a 2/3 vote for the notion of a comprehensive test ban or for the law of the sea treaty. If you take the test ban, it's no longer quite as important as it would have been in the 60s, where we blew a chance to establish a test ban. And when it finally came into fruition in the 90s, the Senate turned it down. This is analogous, although not as important, as the United States Senate turning down the League of Nations that Woodrow Wilson negotiated. But these are very serious aspects. But people don't think of trade law as international law, but that's what it's all about. And to take unilateral steps, you can have counterproductive ramifications that happen very quickly, and then to tie them into all other issues is also difficult. For example, Mr. Trump noted in the last few days about the call from the Taiwanese president that he didn't think the status of Taiwan that we've been dealing with it on is the right one, but maybe if there were some trade-offs, he could accept it, like in trade policy. In other words, he's a deal maker. He wants to make a deal. Let's have a different trade policy, and maybe I'll accept the status quo that 8 administrations have accepted on Taiwan. That, to me, has a logic to it, but it's a very dangerous way to go. Likewise, Mr. Trump has come out against the Paris Treaty on the Environment. He's come out against what's called the TPP, which most Americans don't really know, but it's this Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama negotiated, and because it's identified with Obama, people are either instinctively for or against it. Intriguingly to me, it's the one trade agreement that was the most pro-agriculture, because we insisted that people would have certain rights, but our agricultural products could not be blocked in these countries involved. So we had frankly, it was probably as pro-Iowa trade agreement as could be negotiated, but Trump has come out against it. That has implications that are longer lasting than people know, because if it fails, which I think it is going to, it also undercuts the American presidency. It means that we're weaker than we expected to be. It puts these countries more vulnerable to becoming tied closer to the countries that we wanted them to be less tied to. And this brings up this whole issue of how we look at the world. Do we always need to have an enemy? And so in the Cold War, it was easy. Russia was the enemy, or the Soviet Union was the enemy. Now, in a word that I don't consider to be wisely used of President Obama, he wanted a pivot to Asia. And a pivot to Asia makes sense geoeconomically, but if the implication, which is in China, meaning China's the new enemy, that can be a bit awkward. And so we have to be careful how we talk, how we describe, how we proceed in various kinds of ways. In any regard, I want to make one analogy between President Obama and President-to-be Trump. President Obama, like I, had opposed the Iraq War. On the other hand, when he became president, he took office that you have to accept where we were. That is, you don't suddenly pull the plug from everything because America was now entangled. And so obviously President Obama wanted to disentangle and found himself unable to do it in a helpful way, and suddenly we got the development of ISIS, et cetera. And one found that there were ramifications one then had to deal with. And you can't simply say, because I was opposed to the Iraq invasion, I cannot deal with things as they are on the ground today. And you have to make timely decisions in timely ways. Likewise, if you take President-elect Trump, it is rational and credible to be either for or against the deal that Obama made with Iran. But it is totally irrational, in my view, to want to pull the plug on that treaty today. And so if Trump wants to say, I would not have done the deal, that to me is something that's a fair opinion. But in this deal, we had the obligation to do 90% of the things to begin with, and Iran the obligation to do for a long period of time relating to not developing or advancing certain kinds of nuclear weapons capacities. Well, we have already given up all of this money. And by the way, it wasn't United States taxpayer money. This is money that we had sequestered of Iran's that was in this country when we had a sudden difference of a judgment with Iran. And so we sequestered it, and now we agreed to return this amount of money. And that's what Iran really, really wanted. But now, if we break the agreement, it means that they no longer are obligated not to develop nuclear weapons in the way they would otherwise be obligated to do. And so to say, I want to break this agreement is saying, I want to allow the Iranians to continue with their nuclear advances. And to me, that's ridiculous. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. On the other hand, we have the right to keep watching them very closely, and if they do break the agreement on their own, that's one thing. But to break it without their reason, without that kind of reason, to me, is foolhardy. And that might or might not occur. By verbally, a basis has been sent that it could. Whether that'll come to play in this administration, I don't know. Well, let me just conclude partly on this concept of internationalism. I mean, for whatever reason, lots of people in the world want to think instinctively of what matters to them, and people that are disadvantaged in particular. But instinctively, all of us are concerned for ourselves. But there's a big world out there. And if you can develop arrangements where there's a credible quid pro quo, and that's what international agreements are designed to do, that makes certain sense. And if they particularly are designed to decrease the prospect of war, that's even more important. And so playing with trade ends up being playing with politics. And it comes back a little bit to really the essence of political philosophy that I take back to Hobbes and Locke. And if you remember anything about political theory, Hobbes talked about a state of nature versus civil society. And he said a state of nature is where every man was for themselves and life was nasty, brutish, and short because one couldn't accommodate anyone else. John Locke takes the similar paradigm and says the difference between a state of nature and civil society is very simple. It involves two phenomena: rules to govern disputes and some sort of way of arbitration. And if those two things exist, you can have a civilized society. And what the challenge in many ways in the world is how you take this concept and precept of international, of domestic policy and apply it internationally. And so my own view is that lots of things are happening in the world somewhat naturally, somewhat unnaturally, between some doing well and some doing less poorly. And in America, we've entered into kind of a second Gilded Age and something we've got to be concerned about. So my view is that we ought to be looking at policy from three directions. One, we need fairness. That's basically in the development of domestic policy and more than a little international. We've got to be compassionate for those that are disadvantaged or can't left out. And we have to have temperance of statecraft. And I stress this because if we're all self-oriented, and if one looks at the world only as self, and I'm not suggesting only narcissists do that, but I don't know why I came up with that word, but we have to be cautious. And I related, and here I used one thing in talks for several decades now that I think is an analogy that fits international relations profoundly, and that is something called the Alexandria Quartet, which was a group of novels that were very vogue when I was in college, and I read them for a very high-minded reason. I wanted to impress a girl. But anyway, the author Lawrence Durrell wrote four novels set in Egypt between World War I and World War II. And each novel was titled by an individual. In each novel, the individual was part of the same set of minor events in Alexandria, Egypt. That's why it's called the Alexandria Quartet. And so all four novels are about the same set of minor events. And you wonder, why do you read about the same set of minor events four different times? And it ends up that all four stories are totally different. And the literary moral is you can't get a sense for reality of what happens at any point in time from only one set of eyes. And you can apply this at the dinner table, you can apply this in a courtroom, you can apply this in international relations, that to have a sense for what's a wise thing to do, it's not stupid to balance your ideas off people you respect, and also to get a sense for people you don't respect. I mean, why people think the way they do. And so, in a way, this philosophical notion is the heart of the question of internationalism. And I think we throw it out the window at terrifically great risk. Thank you very much.
Okay, would there be greater Western stability with the return of Glass-Steagall?
Well, this is a domestic economic question, and Glass-Steagall had certain constraints. There is a myth that it was repealed. Actually, it was modified. And what Glass-Steagall coupled with something called the Bank Holding Company Act, and the Bank Holding Company Act is actually more significant than Glass-Steagall in this regard, is whether a financial institution can do three things instead of one thing. And the three financial institutions that are play here are the insurance industry, the investment banking industry, and the commercial banking industry. In Iowa, for many decades, commercial banks that are state chartered could sell insurance. So you had that had been authorized. What happened in the 1990s was one major bank, which was called Citicorp, it was illegal for it to enter into investment banking or the underwriting of insurance, but an insurance underwriting company called Travelers, in effect, theoretically bought Citicorp, or merged with Citicorp as if it was the driving force, because insurance companies could own banks. And the Clinton administration allowed that to occur, and it was a patent breach of law. Because Travelers brought with it an investment bank called Solomon that it had bought. So you had the merging of an investment bank, an insurance company, and a commercial bank. And then the administration then authorized that it could do all its functions within the bank. And what that meant, and it's a very subtle banking issue, that you could use insured deposits to do investment banking and insurance underwriting. And that was a breach of spectacular significance. And that is one of the reasons why Congress moved to change this circumstance in an orderly way, and somewhat ironically, and everybody missed, to constrain what the executive branch had done. And so a law was passed that said that these mergers could occur, but only if each of the functions would be separately regulated and separately funded. And that the regulation would say the same in each area. That is, an investment bank could not do commercial banking, a commercial bank could not do investment banking, but the bank holding company could have something that could do all three, but they could not talk to each other. And as you might visualize, that's a hard rule to keep in place. Anyway, part of the background was, if you take the banking industry, that at the beginning of the 20th century, 75% of American savings went to a bank. Towards the end of the century, it was less than 25%. And so you had an industry that was wilting relative to the economy at large. And so the assumption was somehow one ought to do more, partly because non-banks were starting to do things that had never been done before, and were taking advantage, and this might sound odd to you, of the powers that were allowed to commercial banks. And so a law passed. Now, the issue isn't to me whether a bank can do multi-purpose things. The issue to me is size. And does it allow banks to get too large and to get over-leveraged? The reason we had a catastrophe in 2000, 2008 is principally, although there are a lot of reasons behind it, the national banking regulators allowed our biggest banks to get along with skinny capital. Iowa, by the way, and I think there's a lot of reasons for everyone in this state to be kind of proud of our state systems. We have the strongest capitalized banks in the United States and the strongest regulation of banking in the United States. And the federal regulators, on the other hand, allowed New York banks to operate often as much as on 2% capital, whereas Iowa's on 11% capital. If New York had had Iowa capital standards, no New York bank would ever have been needed to be bailed out, with the possible exception of an investment bank called Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers, by the way, in 2004 under the W. Bush administration, was regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and it issued a ruling that the biggest 7 investment banks in America could triple their leveraging. If that rule had not been changed, Lehman would never have gone under, and we probably wouldn't have had the catastrophe we had, at least to the same degree. Now, the catastrophe began with housing, and people forget that the totality of the American housing industry is many, many times bigger than the capital of any financial institution. We're talking many trillions of dollars. And it had disproportionate problems. Frankly, housing in Iowa never got out of hand. You can buy a house in Cedar Rapids, Davenport, Iowa City, although Iowa City is going up a bit, at pretty credible sums of money. What happens when housing goes up hugely in value and income does not? And what happens in addition if you get fraud involved in the process, which occurred with what are called mortgage brokers? You can have a calamity. But I personally relate most of this not to this thing called Glass-Steagall, but to the prudence of national banking regulators, which I personally think that have gotten away with almost no accountability, but the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, let the spotlight of discipline weaken. Thank you.
Thanks to those of you who provide us with these really thoughtful questions, by the way. The next question is about the need for an enemy. If always having an enemy is not helpful, what might be a better reference point for American foreign policy?
Well, let me apply it to both domestic and international. One can have rivals, and that's a whole different way of looking at it. A rival you can respect. An enemy, it's no holds barred, and it's a conceptualization we've got to think about internally, because American politics has moved into enemy formulations, and that means you don't listen to them, and you presume. I served 18 years in the minority and 12 in the majority in Congress, and I always thought when I was in the minority that the majority party was a bit arrogant. But I really respected what it was trying to do, and I respected their people. I loved Tip O'Neill. I thought he was one of the loveliest men in American politics. But that didn't mean you didn't vote against him. And we have real problems today. Now we have this caucus politics that everyone is supposed to keep to the party line. And it's not good for society. And you have a little bit this in internationally. I mean, it is true that America is in a position that realism demands that we be prepared. But realism also demands to me that you listen to the other side and you take into consideration perspectives of your allies as well as your rivals. And then your allies can be significant rivals. And let me give you an example that I think is quasi-humorous, but is really profound. In international relations and trade, we have a law that says an American company cannot bribe abroad. Well, that's disadvantageous to our trade because our allies bribe like mad. And I remember just very vividly a little clip on television that made me laugh and cry at the same time. It was a meeting of the Group of 7 or Group of 20 in Berlin. And George W. Bush was standing next to Tony Blair and at a press conference. And someone says, Mr. Blair, it's just been revealed that a British company has given a $2 billion bribe to Saudi Arabia insiders. By the way, a bribe that was given in Washington, D.C. to the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States for an $80 billion aircraft order. And basically it allowed Britain to get the winning order over Boeing. In other words, Britain disadvantaged an American company. And Tony Blair's response was, well, you know, we have to be concerned about our economy. And nothing was then said. Well, that is our greatest ally in the world. But at that instance was a total rival, and a rival using a technique that most of us would say is immoral, if not illegal. I mean, that is something you deal with in the world.
All right. Since we're now close to running out of time, I'm going to make this the last question, but I'm going to combine a couple. So these are questions that are interested in your thoughts on the future of American power in the world. So one asks about American exceptionalism and what its future role might be. Another is about the degree to which countries around the world will look to the U.S. In the future for influence as opposed to Russia and China.
Well, first, there are very few words that one should be more careful about. The United States of America has an exceptional history. But that doesn't mean we're always exceptionally wise. And so some people in politics have taken the word exceptional to mean, I am wise, I know what to do, if you differ with me, it's foolish. Well, actually, the only way you can continue an exceptional history and build on an exceptional history is to be exceptionally wise. And to be exceptionally wise, one ought to listen to other points of view and learn, as well as at sometimes in places there's a case to be firm. But this is a term of art that drives the rest of the world nuts. Because in a sense, every entity in the world has an exceptional position that's unique to itself. Now, I think America has a position that is exceptional to itself and to the world. At least when we think of the only 2 world wars in human history, we have reason to be proud. We have reason to think of the greatest generation as the greatest generation. And they not only won, by the way, the greatest war in history, they then proceeded to win the peace at great cost to the American taxpayer. Dwight David Eisenhower, as President of the United States, as a Republican president, had almost twice as high tax rates as Barack Obama. That's an interesting phenomenon to think through, and he needed to because he was repaying World War II debt and paying for the cost of making sure that another war not occur. And we saved Europe in one sense militarily, in a second sense economically. And these are things that we ought to be proud of. But every circumstance is different. I mean, the first major tax cuts came under John F. Kennedy, and they were valid because we had paid our dues. And we can now look at starting to cut taxes. Now we're going to have a bit of a tax cut. It may be a significant one. It may or may not work, and it may or may not be justified. And this is the type of thing that only time will tell.